My name is Richard Stammelman. I'm the executive director of the Montgomery Endowment, and I'm pleased that you've come. The endowment was created in 1977 by Ken Montgomery and his wife Harle Montgomery. Ken graduated from Dartmouth in 1925. And during the past almost 30 years, we now have had close to 180 fellows who have visited Dartmouth as Montgomery Fellows. And the fellows and the endowment are both oriented mostly toward undergraduate students. That's the way it was set up. It was established that way. And it's because of that reason, it's really quite unique because these individuals come here to teach and to interact with undergraduates. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this summer's Montgomery Fellow, Alex Kotlowitz. Alex is a practitioner of what has been called the new journalism. Journalism of empathy. This is a journalism in which the writer places not only him or herself, but his or her readers in the shoes of his or her characters. Alex has himself said, and I quote, that he is a teller of authentic, genuine stories. And indeed, with unbending honesty, a steely moral consciousness, and an unwavering belief in fairness and justice, Alex's dramatic stories about poverty, immigration, and racial injustice have been told in the pages of The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, and The New Republic. For 9 years, he was a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, and he covered social policy and urban affairs. His radio and television reporting has been featured on NPR's This American Life and All Things Considered, and PBS's Frontline and Media Matters. One of the 3 personal audio narratives, and they had the name Stories of Home, which he created in 1993 for Chicago Public Radio, was honored by a George Foster Peabody Award. It's one of the oldest prizes given in the United States for excellence in the electronic media. He's also received the Robert Kennedy Journalism Award, the George Polk Award, the Carl Sandburg Award, and finally, the John Lafarge Memorial Award for Interracial Justice. At present, he is finishing a Frontline documentary with a co-creator. It's called The Interrupters, and it's about a group of young, not so young, I mean, they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, a group of former Chicago gang members and drug dealers who intervene in potentially dangerous situations, diffusing anger and calming tempers before people start pulling out their guns and killing each other. He's shown part of this documentary to some classes here. Alex's first book, There Are No Children Here, has sold over 500,000 copies and was described in 1995 by the New York Public Library as one of the most important, 150 most important books of the 20th century. It's a poignant, unrelenting, unflinching chronicle of the weekly, monthly, and year-by-year struggle for survival of 2 young African-American boys in a Chicago housing project who fight against poverty, police harassment, drugs, imprisonment, gang violence, hopelessness, the threat of death, as well as against an indifferent municipal bureaucracy. Alex's second book, The Other Side of the River, A Story of 2 Towns, a Death, and America's Dilemma, is no less a grippingly powerful narrative. It tells the compelling story in intimate detail and with the suspense more typical of a mystery novel than a work of nonfiction, of the reactions of 2 neighboring Lake Michigan towns, one nearly totally white, the other nearly totally black, to the death of a young African-American boy. Alex's third book, which is entitled Never a City So Real, A Walk in Chicago from 2004, recounts the contemporary history of his adopted city through the personal and idiosyncratic experiences of ordinary Chicagoans who are anything but ordinary, a retired steelworker, a maintenance man who basically has become an artist, a union organizer, and many other such individuals. In all 3 books, and in his many magazine articles and his reports from the field as a correspondent for NPR and PBS, Alex investigates with passionate doggedness and almost superhuman objectivity the fissures that have cut across the racial landscape of America, or as he puts it, and I quote, the dramas of ordinary lives on either side of the divide, end of quote. He's looking for the telling story and the telling detail within that story. He searches for the narrative of an individual or of a community that will represent what is fundamentally local, like the racial and class biases of the two small Lake Michigan towns in the other side of the river. That's what's local. And what is also quintessentially national, because the voices of the citizens of these off-the-beaten-path towns and cities are, alas, representative of the prejudices and racial insensitivities of so many other American cities and towns. Discovering the untold tale and telling it are not Alex's only goal. Stories are but means, important and eloquent means, to a yet more essential end, namely the discovery of truth. Behind the curtain of the stories he tells, in their overlapping layers and folds and creases, in what they reveal and what they leave behind, lies a truth, albeit provisional, maybe even illusory, but a truth nonetheless that shines a light on the reality of American social life since the 1980s. If at times this truth goes in and out of focus, this confusion does not discourage the superb reporter, writer, and commentator of American urban life that Alex Kotlowitz is. And I quote, "Each time I aim for the truth, home in on it, the bullseye all but disappears. Or at times, as I approach what I think are facts, the bullseye multiplies, each taking on a different shape and hue, so that as my vision darts from one to the other, I don't know where to land. The facts become elusive. Such is the story of race. Truth becomes myth, myth becomes truth, and your perspective, myth or truth or myth, is shaped by which side of the river you live on. In the end, all that matters is what you believe." And so it is a great pleasure for me to present to you Alex Kotlowitz, whose lecture this afternoon will deal with the subject, and I quote, "The House of Secrets, Storytelling and Human Rights." Alex.
Well, thanks, Richard, for that generous introduction. First of all, I got to say what an honor and privilege it is to spend the summer here in Hanover, and I don't know how anybody gets any work done here during the summer. Somebody asked me the other day whether I'd found my rhythm, and I don't know that there's any need to find your rhythm here in the summer. It's just been a glorious few weeks so far, and I've got another month to go. I want to begin this afternoon with a story, and it involves a young woman named Dee Dee. I first met Dee Dee 23 years ago when I was working on my book, There Are No Children Here. She was then a troubled 12-year-old kid. She had a wild streak about her. She got into fights. She cut school. She also had a very troubled family. Her mother was an alcoholic, and her father was often absent. I worried about her. I knew her brother Porkchop well because Porkchop and Farrell, one of the boys in There Are No Children Here, were very close friends. In fact, the three of them were cousins. Well, about 7 years later, after my book had been published, I was passing through the Henry Horner homes, the projects I wrote about, and I ran into Dee Dee in a parking lot. She was, by this time, a young woman. And she looked horrible. She was emaciated, her clothes hanging off of her like sheets on a clothesline. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was a tangle of knots. She seemed in a complete daze. She was leaning against a car, falling in and out of sleep. She was so thin that I feared that she was just going to be blown away with the wind. She barely acknowledged my presence. She'd become addicted to crack cocaine. And I gave her a hug, and it was like holding a collection of bones. I didn't want her to hold her too hard for fear that I would injure her. And I also figured that this would be the last time I'd see her. Honestly, she looked as close to death as one could get without actually dying. She was gone, swallowed by the ravages of her community. Well, I want to fast forward. This is to a few years ago. I'd gotten word that Porkchop, her Dee Dee's brother, who was now in his late 20s, had been shot 6 times coming out of a liquor store, apparently a case of mistaken identity. And as soon as I got wind of the shooting, I drove over to the hospital, and in the lobby, I got on a short line to get a pass to visit Porkchop, who fortunately survived. And behind me, waiting in line, was this young man and woman, both of them very handsomely dressed. And the woman tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, "Alex." And I turned around, and she was smiling, and I tried to place her. And I apologized, and I said, I know you look familiar. How do we know each other? And she laughed and threw her arms around me, and it was Dee Dee. As we waited in line, she told me her story. She said, almost gone, a prisoner of crack. And then she had a child, a daughter, and everything changed. She got herself off of drugs. She began attending church. She met her future husband, a truck driver. And here she was, completely filled out, bright-eyed, and so pointed, so smart. I couldn't stop smiling. I tell this story up front to caution us against what the incredibly talented Nigerian-born novelist Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story. The danger of thinking that people have a single narrative. That, for instance, if you're growing up poor on Chicago's West Side, that your story is the same as the person next door. Or that because you're poor, that we think we know your story. Or in the case of Dee Dee, because you're poor and a drug addict, that we think we know the shape of your narrative. As Adichie warns, show people one way over and over, again and again, and that's what they become. I mention this before anything else because stories are essential to understanding who we are. Stories are how we make sense of the world and how we make sense of our own lives and of those around us. Stories inform policy. They inform the way we allocate resources. They inform our laws. They inform the way we think about ourselves and others. They inform the present, and they help sculpt the future. And so we need to take care not to craft a single narrative, not to pigeonhole people, not to think we already know when in fact we know very little. And this is what I want to talk about today, about how story, how understanding how we got to where we are, and how acknowledging the lives of those whose voices are often lost in the cacophonous noise of ideologues and rhetorical ruffians are essential to our eternal struggle for the maintenance of human rights. Nelson Algren, the great Chicago novelist, once wrote that American literature, storytelling really, is the woman in the courtroom who, finding herself undefended on a charge, asked, "Isn't anybody on my side?" That's the measure of the sway of narrative. Its ability to find that woman, to hear her plaintive voice, to try to answer the question she's posed. Isn't anybody on my side? Given the great divide in our country, what better time than now to try to figure out what holds us together and what pushes us apart, to grasp the contradictions that mar the landscape. Why and how it is we can be both so proud and embarrassed by this country. How it is there can be such generosity beside such neglect. I've been thinking a lot about the place of narrative in recent years, especially in the context of the larger political stage. And I often think about the buildup to the Iraq War. The Bush administration spun out a narrative. And it was a narrative that suggested, make that declared, that Saddam Hussein was a direct threat to our country, that he had developed and hidden weapons of mass destruction, that he was working hand in hand with al-Qaeda. The American Congress, the American press, the American people let that narrative pass unchallenged. And as a result, we went to war with a country thousands of miles away, which in the end did not have weapons of mass destruction, which in the end did not have any relationship with al-Qaeda, which in the end did not pose a direct threat to our country. The narrative we believed is the narrative that drove us. It's the narrative that guided us. Or I should say, in the end, misguided us. It was, as we've come to realize, a false narrative. And so it's important in thinking about story that we recognize that story, if false, if twisted, if massaged, if anything less than honest and frank and square, can misdirect us, can push us into dark and inhumane corners, can spur us into dark and inhumane actions. A democracy, and this goes without saying, dies without transparency. There can be no freedom, no justice, if we operate under false assumptions, if we aren't fully informed, if we aren't fully clued in. Truth is the engine of freedom, and the way to truth is by bearing witness, by telling stories. Stories that are legitimate, that are authentic, that are honest, that are true to what has occurred. Stories that don't serve an ideological purpose. I think of just the other day, the story of Shirley Sherrod, the Department of Agriculture employee that probably most of us are familiar with, whose story of working with white farmers was distorted to serve someone else's stubbornly set view of the world. Let me just take a second here to just tell you a little bit about myself. You know, people ask me what I do for a living, and I tell them I'm an author, I'm a journalist, but the truth of the matter is I'm a storyteller. It's what I love to do most, and it's what, at this point in my life, is about the only thing I think I'm good at. And I tell stories which, to be unsexy about it, are stories that are based in fact. They're stories that are authentic, they're genuine, they're real. It's the never to be chiseled dictum in my profession that what we write must be grounded in fact, that they must be verified by witnesses, by documents, or by my own eyes and ears. The other thing I should tell you about myself, about my work, if you don't already know this, is that I tend to be drawn to stories outside of the center of the storm, or perhaps more aptly put, I find myself running from the storm's center. Part of it, to be quite honest with you, is I don't fare particularly well under competition, which is why I don't work at a daily newspaper any longer. But on a more affirmative note, I relish journeying to out-of-the-way places, to spend time with people who otherwise might go unnoticed, to hear stories never before spoken, to simply hang out with what Studs Terkel called the et ceteras of the world. And so given that, I want to tell you a story. Unlike the narrative behind our war in Iraq, this is a very personal tale. It's a story about a woman named Fanny who was raised by her grandmother, first in Morocco and then in France. Fanny's grandmother, whose name was Salima, would tell a story to Fanny over and over again when Fanny was a child, before she went to bed or over dinner. And the story went like this. When Salima was 4 years old, she was sold off to slavery in Morocco to a very wealthy family. And for that family, she became their cook. But she was determined to find her freedom. But when she came of age, she was married off. And a year later, her husband died, which meant she was finally free. And Fanny was never sure why her grandmother would tell her the story over and over again. Well, when Fanny was 11, they were living in France at the time. Her grandmother took her to Morocco for a vacation. And in Morocco, her grandmother became ill and died. Fanny knew no one. She was on her own. And so she did all that an 11-year-old kid knew how to do, and that was to find a friend of her grandmother's named Fatima, who lived in Casablanca. And so she went and found Fatima and became a part of Fatima's family. And there she was assigned certain chores like washing clothes. She had to go out and buy the groceries every day. She was kept out of school. And all this time, Fanny, this 11-year-old girl, was hoping that they would send her back to France. And I want to just play you a few minutes of Fanny telling you her story.
The family did not care for me to have an education. They just wanted me to be there and do the tasks around the house. They truly thought that they were blessed to have this child who came to them. You know, they didn't have to invest anything to get this commodity. They didn't even have to buy a slave. You know, I came. They felt like they won the lottery. And Fatima, she was thinking about her own status as a woman in Morocco. Pretty soon I was this object that she could show to everybody. Once a week or every other week on a Sunday, we would go to the beach. They would go with the two little boys, and then they had this black little kid carrying the parasol. And for them, I was their signe extérieur de richesse, their symbol status. By showing me, they could tell that they had a certain wealth. At this point, I had been with the family for 4 or 5 months. I was just taking the time to figure out an échappatoire, a way out. It took a lot of time, and I was being very careful. As I was doing my chores, as I was going outside to do the groceries, I was also observing. And I got some money because I was able to pocket some money from going to the grocery store. I just pretended that instead of buying that spice that day, I didn't buy it and I pocketed the money. You could buy envelopes individually, and I bought one and I bought a stamp. And I grabbed a piece of paper from a notebook and I wrote the letter to the French embassy. It's not that extraordinary, even though I was 11. I was doing a lot of things like this for my grandmother. Every time that she needed a letter, I wrote it for her because she didn't know how to write. I wrote that my grandmother died and I've been stuck in Morocco and with the Ghazali family and I would like to go back to France to my father. I did that when I was on an errand for the family. It was very calculated. No one was suspicious that I was gone. I went on a regular basis to the store. So I didn't even know that it was going to arrive there, but I just wrote Ambassade de France, Casablanca, Maroc, and that's it. A week later, 2 gentlemen from the embassy showed up. They came and I just ran out the door and grabbed one gentleman's hand and I didn't want to go back and I was pulling him down the stairs. The family was just in shock. They didn't say anything. 2 days later, I flew back to Paris. I was very happy, I was overjoyed, and it reminded me at that moment, the story as it was told by my grandmother, that she was very happy to find her freedom. So it was like I finally got it. I finally understood what she meant. I thought, this is it. I finally got to the place where my grandmother was, that I finally earned my freedom and that life was going to be much easier.
Well, there's more to Fanny's tale, which I'm going to come to a little later, but a little backstory here. I met Fanny through my wife. Fanny teaches French in the Chicago public schools, and my wife knew tidbits about Fanny's story, and so I called her and asked Fanny if she might want to tell it for a radio series I was producing. And so she came into the studio, and she began to tell her story, and about her grandmother, about ending up with her grandmother's friends, and she cried her way through the whole thing, sobbing at times, and the tape was completely unusable. So my producer and I had to ask Fanny if she would mind coming back once she'd calmed down. And so a couple of weeks later she returned, and though she cried through much of the telling, she was in more control of her emotions. And when we were done, knowing how difficult it had been for her, I asked her why she decided now that she was ready to talk about what had happened to her. She told me that she wanted her children to know her story. She was doing this for them. In fact, she never told them anything about her past. And yet it's so essential to who she is, to who she was and who she became. She told me it was still too hard even after the intervening 25, it was so hard even after these intervening 25 years. All this time she was holding on to this secret. It's understandable. This period in her life just about destroyed her. It was humiliating, it was degrading, it was confusing, it still is. And when I think about how this 40-year-old woman kept the story inside her all these years, I think of others, whether it be a child growing up on Chicago's West Side, or a young girl raped in a Somalian refugee camp who made her way to America as a stowaway only to be detained, or a mother picked up at a chicken processing plant and separated from her children. how they pull inside themselves, how they become utterly confused and disoriented, how they feel humiliated, how they come to look at the world through such cynical and distrusting eyes, how their stories burn inside them, and how such utter loneliness can eat away at one's soul. You know, there's that old William Faulkner line, much overused, that the past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past. And that certainly is the case for those who have been marginalized because of race or class or ethnicity or politics or religion or circumstance. The past not only haunts them, but their past, at least making sense of it, and more importantly, getting others to acknowledge it, may well be their ticket to a reasonably good future. You know, when I first began spending time on Chicago's West Side, in a neighborhood which was so devastated and which so saddened Mother Teresa when she visited that she sent sisters from her order there, the thing that most struck me about my time there was the silence that surrounded the community and its people. And there were two kinds of silences that I encountered. The one which I think is pretty self-evident, and that was a kind of institutional silence that surround the lives of kids living in communities like this. The inability of institutions like the police, the housing authority, the schools, to respond to what had become a weekly, if not daily, crisis in the lives of the kids there. And I always remember an incident early on. I was hanging out at the Boys and Girls Club there, trying to meet some kids to write about. And it's where I met Lafayette and Farrow. And one afternoon I went over to the club, I went over to the community, and it was eerily silent outside. And usually there was all this commotion, this noise in the neighborhood. People were just hanging out on their stoops, and kids were playing basketball. And as I got there, the adults were just beginning to emerge from the high-rises, and I asked them what was going on, and they explained to me that two rival gangs had been shooting at each other from building to building, like rival Navy ships at sea. I then went and asked the kids who were beginning to emerge to the Boys and Girls Club what had happened. They told me the same story that their parents had. Well, being a good journalist, a good reporter, I went back to my office, and the next morning I called the police department. And I got the spokesperson for the Chicago police, and I told her what I had heard, and I told her I was calling just to confirm that, in fact, this incident had indeed happened. And she told me she'd get back to me. And an hour later, I got a phone call, and she explained to me that every morning the police superintendent in Chicago has a phone conference with all the commanders around the city in which incidents like this are discussed. And she assured me that no such incident had been brought up in that morning's meeting, and so assured me that, in fact, it hadn't occurred. Well, I went back out to the community. I spoke to the adults. I spoke to the kids. They told me the same story. And in fact, I spoke to the beat officers there, who not only told me the same story, but also told me that they were so afraid that they were the targets of that shooting that they had taken cover under their squad cars. And I mention this because I think this kind of institutional silence often serves a purpose, not a conscious purpose, but it serves a purpose in the end. And in this case, the police had crafted their narrative that all was okay in this community, that there was no reason to reach out, no reason to extend a hand, and it permitted, justified even, their abandonment of this community or these people. But the other kind of silence, which for me is a much more subtle one, and something I didn't come to terms with until much later, was a kind of self-imposed silence on the part of people living in communities like this, an unwillingness, if you will, to share their stories. And what I came to realize over time, that this was an unwillingness to share their stories out of fear that if they did, they wouldn't be believed. And I will tell you, I've been confronted with this time and time again. And I can remember shortly after the book came out, we were fortunate enough to have, Oprah made it into, it was her first TV movie, and so we were fortunate that Oprah had optioned the book. And when the screenwriter came out from New York, a playwright, a very soft-spoken, quiet, gentle man, I was to be kind of his tour guide to introduce him to the neighborhood and the people I wrote about. And as we began to spend time together, I began to get this uneasy feeling that he didn't believe all that I'd written. And so I took him to the worst of the high-rises. I introduced him to the biggest of the drug dealers and the meanest of the gang members. And on the fourth and last day, he and I and two friends of mine, two women who lived and worked at a neighboring housing complex, went out to lunch at a restaurant, Edna's, on the west side. And as we were sitting in our booth eating our lunch, a young boy, maybe 13, 14 years of age, ran into the restaurant and ducked behind the heating grill. And as he ducked, a group of boys walked by, and one of them pulled a pistol out of a brown paper bag and started shooting. And needless to say, we were scared for our lives. And I remember as we lay there, literally one on top of the other underneath the table, all I could think to myself is, now he's going to believe me. And I mention this because I think this kind of silence, this kind of self-imposed silence, is the most destructive kind of silence there is. And it is the kind of silence that will slowly sap the spirit out of an otherwise spirited people. And what it says to me is something very, very simple. We stop listening. We stop believing. And so when people ask me, where do we go from here, the thing I tell them is we need to start listening. We need to start believing. Indeed, what could be more basic than speaking of our experiences, and more basic than listening to others? You know, stories, when done well, they do two things. On the one hand, they affirm our experiences. They give credence to our personal and collective histories. They make us feel less alone. We've all been there. We've all watched a movie or read a book and said to ourselves, that's my story there. The other thing, of course, that stories do is they allow us to spend time with people we otherwise might not meet, to spend time in places we otherwise might not visit. Stories open apertures into corners of the world that otherwise might remain dark and sequestered, out of sight, out of mind. And stories, I think, are important because people don't like to be pushed or pulled. They don't like to be yelled at or dismissed or pandered, and that therein lies the power of narrative. It lets people find their own way. There is, I think, in these times, far too much shouting going on, too much ranting, too much stay at home, here's what I think, I know what is right, diatribes from people who have little curiosity for the lives of those at all different from their own. You know who I'm speak of, I'm sure. But in the end, what really good stories do, which is what Richard alluded to earlier, is create empathy. They place us in the shoes of others. They let us look at the world through the eyes of others. They help a straight man understand what it's like to be gay, a black man to understand what it's like to be a new immigrant, a Muslim to understand what it's like to be black, a rich man understand what it's like to be poor. They help us see what others see and hear what others hear. Empathy, I want to be clear, is not to be confused with sympathy. Empathy is all about identifying or understanding another's situation, another's feelings, another's motives. It's what Atticus Finch talks about in To Kill a Mockingbird when he tells Scout, in order to understand a man, you need to crawl into his skin. What Atticus is telling Scout is that in order to understand others, you need to be able to place yourself in their shoes. Empathy is a centripetal force of storytelling. I didn't really begin to think about, in any conscious way, about empathy until I began to spend time working on There Are No Children Here when I was over at the Henry Horner Homes. And I remember this very distinctly. I was in the process of writing my book. I was staying at an artist colony. And I was beginning to wrestle in a very visceral way with a fact that I had not really come to terms with. And that was that the mother of the two boys, who I greatly admired, a couple of times every week would go and play cards at the other end of the project. She would go and gamble and spend the night away. And I would find out about this because I would get phone calls from Lafayette and Farrow, who were 12 and 9 years old. I'd get calls in the morning. They didn't have any breakfast cereal. They didn't have a clean T-shirt. They didn't have clean socks. And I would rush down from my north side apartment, maybe bring some food if I had a change of clothes. And I was getting angrier and angrier. And so I'm up there at this writing colony, beginning to write about it, and I realize I've got to wrestle with this somehow because I was angry at LaJoe, at the boy's mother. And I went for a long walk with a woman who I wish to this day that I could remember her name because I owe her a debt of gratitude because it was a real lesson for me. We went on a long walk. I should tell you that I was a single at the time. I didn't have children. And this woman who was a poet from Boston, I was telling her about my concerns, and she began to lecture me. She began to tell me what it was like to be a mother. She began to tell me what it was like to be a single mom, what it must be like to be a single mom living in a place like the projects, and that she suggested that perhaps there was a reason why the boy's mother, a couple of times a week, would journey over to the other end of the projects and spend the night away from her family, that maybe this was the only way she could find any kind of respite from all the forces bearing down on her. And this was, for me, a real lesson in empathy. Here I was, a single man, and what this friend was trying to get me to do was to stand in the shoes of a single mom living in the projects. And it forced me to go back and confront LeJoe and talk with her about it. And in fact, my friend was absolutely right. It was exactly why LeJoe would go and spend the nights gambling. Doesn't mean it justified it, that it made it right, but it helped me and ultimately helped readers understand. Empathy is the underpinning of narrative, and narratives are the underpinning of ensuring that life is fair and just, that people act decently and honorably, that the state embrace its citizen, all of its citizens, and not abuse or abandon them. Elie Wiesel once wrote of those like himself who survived the Holocaust, they persist in surviving not only to survive, but to testify. In other words, they persist to tell their stories and the stories of their loved ones. They persist to share the past so that it might not be repeated, so that we see where we have failed and gain strength from where we have succeeded. I just want to offer a few words of caution. Truth, as we well know, can be elusive, but we especially have to be careful that we don't rewrite our narratives to conform to how we now view the world in the present. We have to be careful that the now, the present, doesn't distort the stories of then, of the past. And I think often of the story of a friend of mine, Ibrahim Parlak, a gentleman I came to know about 5 years ago. Ibrahim grew up as a Kurd in Turkey, and as you well know, the Turks have not been kind to the Kurds. For many years, in fact, they virtually denied their existence. They would refer to them as mountain Turks. And when Ibrahim was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, the Kurdish language was forbidden for official use. Schools only taught in Turkish. Newspapers or television could not use the Kurdish language. Parents could not give their children Kurdish names. Kurdish songs and books were banned. Ibrahim tells the story of when he was a kid, when the military came through his village, and while his father threw their Kurdish books into a fire before the military arrived, Ibrahim and one of his brothers tried to salvage what they could, burying a handful of books, Kurdish books, in a nearby field. And Ibrahim tells me that when he was in first grade, a classmate reported to the authorities that Ibrahim spoke Kurdish at home. And so when he got to school, his teacher hit him with a wooden cane and then humiliated him by making him stand in front of the class all day. It was not an easy time to be a Kurd in Turkey, especially for someone as independent-minded as Ibrahim. And so he soon, when he became a young adult, got involved in politics. And then after being arrested and released, fled for Germany, where he became a leader of the political arm of the PKK, a radical organization that was fighting for an independent Kurdish state. And after 7 years in exile, Ibrahim decided he wanted to go home. And so with a few others, tried to sneak over the Syrian-Turkish border. And on their first attempt, they got into a firefight with a Turkish soldier, and 2 soldiers were killed. Well, Ibrahim eventually got into Turkey and spent 6 months hiding in the mountains before he was captured by the Turkish authorities. In prison, he was brutally tortured and then tried and convicted in a mass trial, along with 57 others. He didn't have an attorney, and he was sentenced to death by hanging for his association with the PKK. The only thing that saved him was that he directed the Turkish police to a buried munitions cache. And so his sentence was reduced, and he was released after serving 16 months, and he quickly fled to the U.S. He came here in 1992, and he applied for asylum, and it was granted. And Ibrahim opened a small restaurant in southwestern Michigan in a small town, and Cafe Gulistan, and he and the restaurant became fixtures in this community. He carved out a life for himself. He had an American girlfriend. They had a daughter together. And then some 13 years later, in July of 2004, the FBI came by and arrested Ibrahim. they charged him with being a terrorist. Now, I want to make it clear here, there were no allegations that Ibrahim was a threat to this country, that he had been involved in any illicit activity here, or that was involved with any militant groups. Instead, the government argued that he had been involved in a terrorist organization and terrorist activity in Turkey nearly 20 years earlier. Well, as legislators reshaped the definition of terrorism, first in 1991, then in 1996, and then again in 2001 in the aftermath of 9/11, Ibrahim's activities in Turkey took on a more sinister coloring. Since 9/11, terrorism, as we well know, has become a much less fluid term, and not unlike during the Cold War when we saw the communist threat in anyone that opposed us, we see terrorism in any group that employs unconventional tactics of warfare. But most importantly, it's colored our view of history. It shifted the way we look at the past. The PKK was not considered a terrorist organization when Ibrahim came over here in 1991. It wasn't considered a terrorist organization until long after he had won political asylum. Well, Ibrahim currently faces an order of deportation. His is a cautionary tale. His is a narrative about the trickery of time. Sometimes the world changes on a dime, as it did on September 11th, and with the transformation of the present, the past too can suddenly take on a different you. Narrative gets rewritten, not to get to any fundamental truth, but rather to fit the narrative of the present. Stories, if we're not careful, can, as it did in the weeks and months leading up to the Iraq War, be used to frighten and manipulate, which is why it's not enough to tell stories. They must be stories grounded in fact. They must be stories whose very reason for being is to get at the truth, or at least to get as close to the truth as we can get to it. They must be stories that are honest to what we see and what we hear. But there's also another way that stories, if twisted, or worse yet, if absent, can get in the way of acting decently and nobly towards others. And this brings me to the title of my talk, The House of Secrets. This has a very specific reference. Each year, 5,000 to 10,000 children, mostly adolescents, come into this country illegally. They come in by plane with smugglers, or slip over the border, or come as stowaways as freighters, and they come here by themselves without an adult. This is my wife's work, and trying to figure out in the end what's in the best interest of these children after they get picked up and detained by the federal government. Is it best for them to stay here or to find their way back to their families? When I think of these children, I'm reminded of something I took away from my time writing about children in the inner city, and that's the self-imposed silence I spoke about earlier. With the kids from the west side of Chicago, it was this fear that they wouldn't be believed. But with the children who come into this country by plane, over the borders, or as stowaways on ships, they hold on to their stories in part because they fear they won't be believed, but also because they've been instructed to distort or to lie. Or they fear that the truth might put them in grave danger, or that they don't know why they were sent here, or it's too difficult for them to face the truth, that parents or others sent them away for good reasons, for awful reasons, for reasons that they may not even know of. One boy I met at the shelter in Chicago, a boy I'll call Ankit. Ankit was from India, and he never disclosed his real story, even after being in custody for nearly 2 years. He claimed that his parents had disappeared because of their political involvement in India. And it was a story he held on to, a story he told to adults who asked. But when he was later pressed and faced with the real story, which we still don't fully know, but the real story that his parents, it turns out, were very much alive, he ran away. He's somewhere out there in this country without a parent, without an adult, without an advocate. He's completely and utterly alone, running from the authorities, and I suppose in no small measure running from himself. Before he ran away, he said that the thing he most feared was disappointing his father. But to this day, we don't know why he was sent here. Was it to satisfy some urge of his parents, or was it because his parents feared for his well-being, or some combination of that? I suppose the easy thing would be to say was he was holding on to a secret, that all these kids are holding on to secrets. But that assumes that they, in fact, know why they're here. Some obviously have come here on their own. Perhaps it's a former child soldier fleeing their country or a teenage girl running from an abusive stepfather. But then there are kids like Ankit for whom their story is not only a secret from us, but also a secret from them. Imagine not so much having a false narrative, but not having a narrative at all. That's the most utter kind of loneliness I know of. And so part of what we must do is try to assist others in piecing together their stories. We must hear them, we must believe them, we must help them bear witness. In New York City, there's an organization called The Door, and it's a kind of refugee for children just like Ankit. One of the counselors there once told me, about the children who pass through, that she said, I think sometimes they just need someone to witness what's happened to them. And this brings me back to Fanny's story. And it's an instructive one. When we left off, the authorities had seemingly rescued her. They'd sent her back to France where she could live with her stepmother and her family of 10 children. Fanny's father at the time, it turns out, was trying to open a new business in northern Africa. And that all seemed like the right thing. And I, again, want to just play a few minutes from her before I end my talk.
So I am in this new household and I realized that the situation is a lot worse than it was in Morocco. A lot worse. They put me to work right away. The chores that I had to do were doubled or tripled, given the amount of people that lived in the house. I was taking care of everybody. I was happy that I was going to school, but I wasn't registered to eat lunch in the school, so I had to come home at lunchtime. And when I came home at lunchtime, I was not allowed to go back to school. I had to stay home and wash the dishes, mop the floors, make everybody's bed, take the trash outside, iron everybody's clothes. But I didn't cook. And I pretended that I didn't know how to cook. So whenever they asked me to boil water, I'll boil the water and I forget it and let it boil. I would put 3 or 4 times a lot of salt in a dish. I would burn stuff, and they would comment on how stupid I was, having a grandmother who was a cook and not knowing how to cook. I burned everything because I didn't want to be a slave like she was. I didn't want to end up like she was, but at the same time, my grandmother wanted something better for me. She had a better hope for me and great plans, and so I was thinking, she made it, and then so can I. So I wasn't going to cook. The only plan I had was to go and meet with the judge who placed me with my father's mother-in-law. I had an idea where the judge was simply because the Palace of Justice was in Poitiers, and I knew that. So my goal was to travel to Poitiers, which is about 30 kilometers from Châtellerault. At this point, I was 13. The day that I planned to run away was the Friday right before Easter break. I came home and spent some time washing dishes, as I usually did. And after dinner, I cleaned more dishes, and I decided to take the trash to the basement. And before doing so, I just grabbed my jacket and I threw it from the window so that nobody would be suspicious. And I took the trash down, and then I just left it there and grabbed my jacket and I ran. To make long story short, the judge investigated and ordered that I would be removed from the family permanently, and made recommendation that I be sent to a boarding school in Lusignan. For the first time, I felt strong. I knew that I was going to make it.
Well, for Fanny, her grandmother's story saved her. It inspired her. It motivated her. In fact, Fanny to this day keeps a small black and white photograph of her grandmother by her bedside. She wants her grandmother to know that she made it. As she told me, she said, "My grandmother told me the story because she definitely didn't want it to happen to me." And it's why she chose to tell her story, so her children could hear it, so it wouldn't happen to them. She wanted to tell her story so that others might learn, so that others might know, so that others might find their way. It is in the end the power of story, that once you know it, once you unravel it, once you can make sense of it, then and only then can you move forward. Only then can you make sense of the past, can you write the present, and find succor and comfort in what lies ahead. Thank you.
Alex would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So who would like to ask the first question?
Oh.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Faye Levine, and I work at the Tucker Foundation here in Dartmouth. And my question was just, how you're able to sort of balance what they were introducing you as sort of a superhuman objectivity or an objectiveness, and looking at the people whose stories are so important to tell, with understanding what you referred to as the importance of what you believe and how that colors what you observe or even exposes you as an observer.
Right. Well, let me take issue a little bit with, and Richard, I don't mean to take issue with you, but take a little issue with the word objectivity, or the sort of application of it to my work, even to the work of most journalists. The truth of the matter, there is no such thing as objectivity. We all come to the world from our own set of experiences. And I think in the end what we really are asking of ourselves in my profession is that we be fair and we be honest. And by honest, I mean that we be willing to sort of challenge ourselves at every corner. And I will tell you that I'm not having a good time, and I'm not working on a story that excites me if I'm not constantly astonished, kind of knocked off balance. But having said that, I want to be clear that I choose the stories I write about. I choose to write about the kids in the projects because I'm angered by the negligence there. I choose to tell Fanny's story because it's a story I think it's important for us to hear. And for me, it's not so much a question of remaining objective, but it's finding stories that you feel passionate about and yet being able to write about them in a dispassionate manner. Because I do feel strongly, as I mentioned earlier, that we don't like to be shouted at. We don't like to be told how to think. And for me, what's most important is to try to figure out a way to tell a story that will allow others to sort of experience the same journey that you had as a writer.
Thanks, Steve.
My name is Professor Roger Masters in the Government Department. I work with a different kind of just institutional silence. It's in science. Blacks tend, in the same environment as whites, to absorb about twice as much lead in their bodies for some technical reasons. Lead is connected with changes in brain chemistry, so where children have high lead, there's more educational failure in adults, there's more substance abuse, and there's more violent crime. There's a stereotype about blacks, that they're dumb, they're drunk, and they're violent. We're poisoning blacks to produce this. I can prove it. I cannot get journalists and papers to pay attention to this research, and particularly I can't get them to see the racial injustice of just not taking care of pollution.
Well, I mean, I don't know about the physiological differences, but certainly African Americans, people who are living in, in old, dilapidated housing, are certainly more likely to be exposed to lead. And as you suggest, lead can have very deep and profound effects on the mental well-being and mental development of individuals. And it is something I think it's worth looking at. I don't think it by any means explains all that's going on out there. I mean, I think there are other factors that we have got to consider, not the least of which are these communities that really lack resources. These are, kids who tend to attend schools that are deeply and woefully underfunded. They live in communities that are woefully, where there's a real lack of jobs and real employment. So I think there are other factors as well, but I would agree with you that lead poisoning is something that we have not looked about, something we think has already been taken care of, and yet and I just know from very personal experience that if you spend any time in these communities, that it is something that we don't pay enough attention to.
Hi, I'm Sarah Stearns. I'm a child psychologist here at Dartmouth. And before I came here, I worked on Chicago's South Side at La Rabida Children's Hospital. Oh, yeah. And I just wanted to comment on your point about empathy. We used your book, There Are No Children Here, as a required reading for our trainees coming in, from Kansas or Iowa, or I shouldn't pick on the Midwest, Vermont. And
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, exactly. And just to give them a little bit of a sense of what it was to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I remember once having a little boy leave his McDonald's in my office, or he wouldn't leave it in the office when he wanted to use the restroom. And I said, "Don't you want to leave it here?" And he said, "No, I don't want the bugs to get it." And I remember being very struck by that and thinking, I really don't get it, and I don't get it yet. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that empathy, because I think it's very helpful.
Oh, well, thanks. And actually, La Rabida does incredible work, and one of the places where they work, which I think is really important, is dealing with trauma and kids, especially as it relates to violence.
Hi, yeah, my name is Alexis Jetter, and I teach journalism here, and some of my students are enjoying and taking your class,
okay.
So thanks for coming. My question is about the future of long-form journalism, which you do so beautifully. I spend most of my time unwriting. I don't have the places I write for are. I mean, the room for the long story is shrinking, and so the stories shrink, and the complexity and nuance, and truth of those stories shrink. So, I've spent a good chunk of today unwriting a story, and it's for Reader's Digest, so that's by definition. But would you talk a little bit about the future of storytelling in an environment, in an economy where they're getting turned into, haiku's a nice word for it, right. Where they become caricatures, and so they undo the very nature of the goal that you seek in telling stories.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that I'm deeply concerned about the state of my profession and my craft. I don't think it's just only long-form journalism. I mean, one of the things that has me deeply troubled is just the very future of our newspapers. And certainly, as you suggest, there have been less and less outlets for really thoughtful or provocative storytelling. But I think there are things that be encouraged about. I mean, one is radio. I think some of the most inventive storytelling out there is going on in radio, in public radio. And I think public radio is here to stay. I don't think that's going anywhere, and it has not only a loyal audience, but a growing audience. I think also when I look at film, at documentary film, which has grown in leaps and bounds over the past 10 years, and also because of the expansive nature of cable, there are more and more outlets for that as well. So I want to be careful that I'm not too sanguine don't sound too sanguine about this, because I am deeply concerned about the future of my craft. And the thing that most troubles me at the moment is just the future of metropolitan daily newspapers and what that means to us as a democracy. I don't think we've really begun to grapple with that. I live in a city in Chicago where both our newspapers are in bankruptcy at the moment. 5 years we may be without a paper. I think the thing that we sort of have to figure out is the internet, is how there was all this great hue and cry about the democratization of the media when the internet sort of blossomed a number of years back, but it's also complicated things. I mean, you go on the internet, you don't know what to believe. People use the internet less to tell stories and but instead really to sort of shout at others. I think that there are places on the internet that are beginning to experiment with long-form storytelling. So I think we need to find those ways and find those outlets. I mean, personally and professionally, it is deeply troubling.
Question here.
I was very moved by your talk, and it was hopeful. And I guess what I want to say to you is, you talked about a little bit when you the issue that troubles me most as an American is the undocumented workers and the raids and the separation of families and such that you did talk of. I work with migrant workers not too far from here, and until I started working with them, I wasn't aware of the numbers that are, I mean, Vermont wouldn't have the dairy farm industry it has without the number of migrant workers that are there. And I guess I tried this with Tracy Kidder, so I'm going to ask this of you now. There's a story there to be told. And I know that from your stories can spring hope, because whenever I leave the families I work with, I come home and I cry. I feel so badly. And so I'm trying to move away from that. So I guess I'm just, maybe as a suggestion, since you're here, and I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you're here, would you consider a story on migrants, and not even, not California, but even regionally? We have so many in New Hampshire and Vermont that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always looking for stories. I mean, Tracy's last book, Strengthen What Remains, is a beautiful narrative about somebody who comes here as a refugee. And I write a lot about immigration and will continue to. And for me, it's just a matter of finding those stories that I feel shed some light. I think the challenge for us as storytellers, when you talk about matters like immigration or race or poverty, is to find ways to tell stories that engage people. It's easy for me to talk to people who think like me. I think the challenge is to sort of pull people in who might think differently from myself. And so in the end, it's all about finding those stories that are going to have that kind of power. So I'm always looking for stories, always looking for a good tale.
Thank you for your comments and for addressing our summer enrichment students yesterday. They are still talking about your ideas. I wondered, you referred to, I think it was pork chops being shot and going to the hospital, and to seeing Dee Dee later. And I wondered how you blend these lives into your own life, and how you tell the stories, and and keep yourself together too, and draw lines that.
Right. Well, for me, one of the real perks about what I do is that a lot of the people, not everybody, because not everybody I write about likes what I've written, but that a lot of the people I write about become a part of my life, some more than others. And I will tell you, I feel like my life is far more richer for it. In fact, at our wedding some 17 years ago, I think we had a couple of dozen people there who were people who I'd gotten to know because they were subjects of stories. So I love that about my work, and I feel that I have this incredibly cosmopolitan life, not because of who I am or because of where I live, but rather because of the work I do. And I cherish that. Boundaries, it can be tough. I mean, you spend, 2 or 3 weeks with somebody, I think it's much clearer, but you spend a year or 2 or 3 with somebody, and it's inevitable you build some kind of relationship with them, and sometimes it can be complicated and tangled. I've got a family of my own. They're my priority, but there are other people who are in our lives, and I feel pretty fortunate for that.
The question.
Hi, I'm Patricia. I'm a student here. I was wondering, with all your experience in telling other people's stories throughout the years, what have you found most important and also most challenging about even just approaching someone and sitting down with them to talk to them?
Well, for me, I will tell you, so I've been at this for over 30 years now, and the hardest thing for me is that kind of metaphorical first knock on the door, whether it's a phone call or, because I have this constant fear that I'm going to have this door shut in my face, and it happens, So for me, that's still the hardest thing, is to still make that first approach to somebody. I can find all these excuses for myself about why I shouldn't bother, about why it's, maybe this isn't the right person. But I find inevitably that once I'm let in, that once that kind of trust, and part of it is time and patience, but once you're able to build that trust, that I don't want to leave. And I feel like that way with this film I'm working on now. We've spent the past year and a half following 3 individuals, and these are people, one in particular who I know will be a part of my life afterwards, and it's hard to sort of let go, and that's where a good editor comes in, because they pick up the phone and say, so where's the film, or where's your article? So for me, that's still the hardest, is that very, first knock on the door, trying to get somebody to, let me in. And I don't, part of the problem is I don't fully know what I'm asking. I don't know whether I'm asking somebody to just talk to me for that afternoon, or whether I'm asking them to spend the next 2 years of their life with me. And so that's tough. And I always remember the story, a number of years ago, I did a story for the New York Times Magazine about a young Chinese man, a young man from China who was 23. He had come here like these kids I talked about when he was 14, except he didn't get picked up by the authorities. And so it was a story about his journey. He had to pay off a $40,000 debt. And I went to Deng. I had met him through one of his attorneys, and Deng was open to the idea of my telling his story. And we spent time together, and one day turned into 2, turned into 3. I came back for another visit. He lived in New York. I came back for yet another visit. At one point, Deng said to me, somewhat accusatorily, he said, I thought you were doing a magazine article, not a book. And I just had to explain to him, this is how I operate. And again, I don't know what to ask initially. I don't know what it's going to take. And also the other thing is, to be honest, I can be very, my presence, my questions can be intrusive. But I also know enough when to back away. That I'm there at the invitation of whomever I'm spending time with, and so for me, I have to respect that privilege.
Are there any other questions?
Hi, my name's Charlie. I'm a townie here. So you talked about how activating empathy is one of the main points, one of the main ingredients of your narratives. And with that, there's a part of the audience that you said you were trying to change their viewpoints, and I think that's fantastic. But what about like the rest of us who are already on like your side of the debate? And you tell these fantastic stories, and the empathy is definitely activated in us. But from here, where is the next step?
Right. Well, that's not, in some ways, it's funny, I was asked this just the other day, the answer is I don't know, because I know what I'm good at. I know what I love to do, and that's to tell stories. And my hope is that to bring us into places we otherwise might not visit. And maybe it'll spur you to action. Maybe you'll leave a little bit more hopeful than you were when you set off. Maybe you'll feel a little richer for it. Maybe it'll make a decision. It'll help make some decision in your own life. I can't speak to that. I mean, I hope it does all of that. But I'm not. Public policy is not my bailiwick. It's not to say that I don't have very strong feelings about certain pieces of policy. Electoral politics is not something I particularly enjoy. So for me, I'm just a storyteller. And my hope, and it's a kind of modest one, is to pull people in and let them have the same journey that I've had. So.
One more question? Is there one?
Actually, it's not a question, but it is a comment. You were talking earlier about your stories, and a lot of people, we all are probably on your side, and we agree with you, but then I've done a lot of work. I'm a school teacher, and I also used to sell books door to door when I was, paying my way through school, and I worked in the census out in Canaan, and where some people said, or Grafton, I'm not going to tell you anything other than my name and address. And I think for me, what's important about stories is the empathy that Charlie talked about. We have a lot of people who are part of the Tea Party movement, and then, nobody's making sense, nobody's talking to each other, everybody's sort of on their own side. And I think what's important is to listen to people and incorporate it into my thinking. Well, maybe, you know, they have a point of view. Things are, you know, not going well with the economy, and we don't want to spend money. And so anyway, I try to be open and empathetic when I'm listening to people. And when you mentioned Strength and What Remains, I think the thing that hit me really hard about that book was the ending. I mean, I cried through like the last third of it, was when he was working, he opened the clinic over there in Africa. And after all that death and genocide, and one of the Hutus came to work, and people said, well, why are you allowing him to work? He's killed people. And what the man said, if only I had known sooner how life could have been different, I wouldn't have done all that. So I think it's important to even listen to that man's story, someone who was killing,
Right.
and yet he changed his mind. And I think we all have that ability within us to listen to somebody else, even if we can't stand them and what they stand for. You know, maybe we will find some common ground.
Right. Right. No, and I think it's important. I mean, I think it's also important, and I should have mentioned this probably earlier, but I think one of the things that's critical to any good storytelling is to recognize and acknowledge that people are complicated. I mean, there's truthfully very little good and evil in this world, and the truth of the matter is we all fall somewhere in between. And so one of the challenges, I think, in telling stories is that you really be honest to the stories that you're hearing, to what you're seeing. And that sometimes means stepping on the other side of the river and sort of finding empathy there. And that can be tough. I mean, it's, you know, not all the people I write about are necessarily sympathetic characters. Not necessarily people you would all want to necessarily spend time with. But yet what's the challenge is I don't want you to necessarily feel for them. I want you to sort of get inside them and sort of try to understand a little bit better about sort of how they got to where they are. So, well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alex.